Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our latest webcast on a common theme. Procure to pay unplugged. Sometimes less is more. I think the unplugged element will become apparent as we go through this. We're talking about driving process transformation from the core and from first principles, and I think we're going to learn a lot from our guest speaker today. And I know a lot of you have been attracted by his photograph of him as a young man, but he's had his hair cut. And Tim Pumphrey, I'm very pleased to welcome Tim. He's a senior manager in Procure to Pay. He's a GBS expert. He's a top 100 AP influencer. He's got a lot of experience. He's worked with a great team at Tarmac, part of the CRH group. So welcome, Tim.
Yeah, hey Dan, hi everyone.
Thanks, and I'm the guy on the left. I'm Dan French, and I know many of you, so thanks for joining us. Our discussion today, it's advertised at 30 minutes. I think it's going to run to about 35, so hopefully that works for you, but we're going to try and make sure we get it as tight as we can. I'm going to give a few introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about process change and transformation as context, because Tim and his team's experience is really relevant to some of the lessons that we're seeing elsewhere. And then I'm going to hand over to Tim to talk about his unplugged experiences driving P2P performance improvement. I'm going to come back then and look at what we can learn from it and how we can apply that elsewhere. And there's a lot of lessons here. It's free of charge. Learn what you can. And I'm sure you're going to have questions. So as we go through, ask questions. There's a Q&A panel on the GoToWebinar interface. Ask questions as they occur to you. We'll answer the ones we can at the end of the session. Those we can't, we'll respond by email. You know, this is a great opportunity to learn from peers and get some new perspectives. If you've got any technical issues, again, try Q&A, the Q&A panel again, and one of our team will endeavor to help you. So just in terms of context, I guess without running a poll, my suspicion is about 70% of you work in a shared services, global business services group or organization, and probably 30% work into a classic financial operations accounting unit. But this, we did just before the pandemic, we did a survey of these leaders, these GBS shared services and finance leaders, and asked them a number of things. And one of them was, what do you aspire to? What do you aspire to as a leader of a business? And what things are you really trying to aim for? And these were interesting observations, and they relate very much to what we're discussing today. First one was enhancing the reputation of the organization as a value creator as well as a cost reducer, because we can't cost reduce our way to success. It's a key part of the mix, but it's not the primary driver. They want to be a center of excellence with the expertise to optimize and automate as well as operate. You know, the key thing here, that continuous improvement, digitization, and so on. End-to-end business process collaboration. A lot of discussion about global process ownership. We use the term collaboration to encompass various disciplines, but that was a big aspiration. Digitizing integrated processes, another aspiration. And finally, if you do all of these things well, then the byproduct is we'll have a talent pipeline for the entire business, and we'll be the envy of other business functions who are going to want to take our people, which is obviously a mixed blessing, but it is a good indicator, a lagging indicator of success, if you like. Now, when we talk about end-to-end process collaboration and global process ownership, you know, we know kind of what an end-to-end process is. It's got a start and an end. And here's a very kind of simplistic view, if you like, of source and purchase to pay in an almost cartoon format. But you know, it's a much more complex dynamic in reality, and you all will know this. You know, we're talking about an end-to-end cycle, end-to-end value stream that starts with business demand. It leads through sourcing and procurement, contracting with suppliers, you know, requesting and ordering, fulfilling, which is getting the goods or services, and settlement, which is classic payables and reconciliation, and the accounting element. You know, that's a big end-to-end cycle. And there's a lot of stakeholders, and of course we're talking about a big geography. Most organizations here are global, but even those that working in one continent or country, you've still got geographic challenges. So it's really important to recognize this, and we all know that for those of you on the accounts payable end of the discussion, the settlement piece, you know, 95% of the issues in accounts payable or invoice to pay are caused to the left-hand side of the process, right? We know that. And that's one of the reasons that for all processes, we want to get end-to-end value stream view, because if you can source, address issues and challenges at the beginning, it makes the whole process more effective and efficient. But the key element here is about control versus influence. End-to-end processes, you rarely, if ever, have control over an end-to-end process. You only have influence. So it's kind of really important to think about that dynamic, and we're going to hear a bit about that from Tim. So I thought that's important to share. Now, when we look at source to pay, purchase to pay, there's a lot of reasons why people want to improve and transform and change. But again, in discussions with leaders, GBS leaders, procurement leaders, finance leaders, there are only 6 key reasons why people want to drive improvement in source to pay and P2P. And they all kind of fall into, or all of the reasons fall into these 6. And it's either reducing the effort and cost of process operation, which we all can identify with. That's a classic efficiency drive. It's optimizing working capital, making sure we're making best use of our cash. It's managing risk. It's reducing maverick spend, which is making sure our spend is controlled and guided by the business rather than random. Reducing the cycle time process, which is about making buying simple for the business, and reducing costs of goods and services, which is a classic remit of sourcing and procurement. And those are the big 6, and pretty much everything else falls into those. But as we know, in service delivery, when you're actually running the process for a large organization, the devil's in the detail, right? There's a lot of detailed challenges, and I'm not going to go through all of these, you'll be pleased to know, but you'll recognize these. And there's a lot of big challenges here, and that's why it's kind of helpful to kind of simplify to the big 6, because otherwise it's very easy to get blinded to these individual elements. Now, today we're going to hear very much from Tim about the approach they took to this. So we talked about this end-to-end process, but there isn't one route through a global process, whether it's source to pay, purchase to pay, or customer to cash, or record to report, or anything. There is no one journey. Even the best made process doesn't have a single journey through it. There are many journeys through it, and this is a mapping technique we certainly recommend. The stages of the end-to-end process, and the kind of the kind of definition and assessment, and the challenges and the weaknesses and the risks sort of allocated. But the point is, there's never one, and I think that's the first kind of problem we fall into. We tend to assume there's only one right route, and there isn't. There are multiple routes. So here's the classic example of purchase to pay. In this case, there's 7 perfectly reasonable journeys through the source to pay P2P process, and it might be more than that. So first thing to remember is, the direct spend may not behave the same as indirect non-PO spend for your utilities, for example, clearly. Intercompany behaves differently to P-card spend, and so on. But we know that the call is always, well, why don't you just digitize it? If you digitize the process, it's going to solve all your problems, right? And we hear that all the time. But we kind of also hear that 70 or 80% of digital transformations fail to deliver the value projected at kickoff. So there's a conundrum there. And when we say, and that's kind of pretty, I think 70% is pretty conservative actually, but that's not to mean that 70% of digital transformations fail. It's not about failure, it's about they fail to deliver the value projected at kickoff, which is either the absolute amount of return is usually overstated, but far more importantly, the timescale for that return is usually far too optimistic, let's say. And a lot of the returns from these process transformations are because of the engagement with suppliers and external ecosystems. This can often take years to deliver the value, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a question of being real about it. So the digitization challenge and opportunity is definitely there, but we've got to be realistic about what we're trying to achieve, and we've got to be realistic about the timeframes and the value we're going to deliver it in. And I do like a good cartoon, and I'm sure you have your own buzzwords in your own business. There's usually, I heard on the radio coming into the office today, top 10 buzzwords for business, and digital transformation is one of them. And of course, everyone nods wisely. And there's a lovely little cartoon here which illustrates kind of one of the challenges. But when we think about technology and digitization, it's really important for us to bear in mind what it's there for. And this is a great, simple, but powerful articulation. So automation or digitization magnifies or amplifies the efficiency of operations. It amplifies the efficiencies of processes, but also it amplifies the inefficiency of processes. And that is very true. We know that, absolutely from experience. And that tells you one thing, is you want to make sure you've got an efficient, effective process that you're automating before you start automating it. Otherwise, there's a world of hurt. So there's another little cartoon, which I quite like. In a lot of things we see more and more in the complex world we operate in, is a lot of that idea of just digitize it. There's a lot of things that seem to make sense on the surface, but a lot of the simple answers just aren't, they're not quite right. And sometimes the complex answers are the kind of road less traveled. And I think we're going to hear a little bit of that from Tim. So, as I say, talking of answers, you're going to have questions. You may even have questions of what I've said, but you're going to have questions for sure on what Tim talks about. So make sure you ask them as they come up. I want to get as many questions as possible. But whether you like your music unplugged by a guy with a very small acoustic guitar, or whether it's a bit of Nirvana, a bit of Segovia, or a bit of Eric Clapton, our Unplugged today is Tim Pumphrey. So Tim, welcome, and I'm glad to see you haven't got your guitar with you today, but love to hear your story.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for that. And hello to everyone who's on the call. For those of you who are on the call who may not know me, I'm sure there are some people on the call who do know me, but for those who don't, just to give you kind of a little potted history, over the last sort of 10 years, I've worked for a couple of big companies, worked within P2P, and been quite heavily involved in business reorganizations, automation, offshoring, process improvements. So I wanted to say thanks to Dan for giving me this opportunity to talk to you guys around kind of a process improvement challenge that we had at Tarmac, and to talk you through how we went about it and get down to some of the detail, and then tell you, in terms of where we ended up in terms of improving that process. So the background to the challenge is we had communication from our CEO who had gone to a virtual conference back in 2020, and he was aware that our first time match rate was fairly low, but actually when he was talking to the other execs that were on the conference, he began to realize that actually others had a much higher first time match rate, and he actually came back and wanted us to dig deep into our processes and actually address where we were in terms of first time match rate. So that kind of gave us the mandate in terms of he wanted us to make this improvement. So we sat up around and kind of thought about first time match rate, what it meant, and also if we were reporting it, which we were at the time, did we actually fundamentally believe that it was 100% accurate? And so we actually then started to revise what we were producing in terms of report and how the first time match was actually being calculated. So first time match rate being that kind of straight through processing, it is that element of what we do where you're able to actually match the PO, the invoice and the GRN, the goods receipt, without any manual intervention. So you can just go straight through, post it to the ledger, hits the payment run when it's due to be paid, without any manual kind of intervention from any member of the team. So that's what I mean by kind of the first time match rate. But actually, it might be worth, Dan, just asking if we can get some sort of gauge from the audience around what their view of what their first time match rate is.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I mean, that's just one, we're talking first time match rate, but you have a number of different metrics and KPIs I'm sure you use. But on this topic, I'm going to ask you, this is the only poll question for you, so have a think about this. what is your first time match rate? Is it 1, 80% plus, 2, 50 to 80%, 3, 20 to 50, 4, under 20%, or 5, I don't know, or it depends how you calculate it. And please give it a go, give it your thought. If you don't know, it's obviously number 5. If you do know, it's between 1 and 4. It shouldn't be too arduous, but if you're struggling to think, oh, I don't know what it is, we've given you some pretty big bands, but equally, if you don't know, or you're not sure how you calculate it, give it a go. But please give us your response, because I think you'll find it interesting to see what other people say. But you have to click 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So, okay, let's have a look at the results. So that's kind of interesting. You know what? That isn't what I expected. So the biggest single segment are in the 50 to 80, which is pretty good. I actually thought the biggest single segment was going to be don't know, it depends how you calculate it, but that is third. But yeah, that's, so you see where you're sitting, and good to see folks at 80% plus. Good stuff. Okay, well, thank you for that. Back to you, Tim. Actually, before we go back, you told us how you calculated. Do you have any special tricks there about how you calculated FTMR?
No, I mean, obviously, well, not obviously, but we use SAP, so we were able to code a reason code so that when we did have that match that was done automatically, we actually coded it as a first time match. So when we ran reports, you could easily then extract out by individual businesses or vendors, so you can actually look at what the first time match rate was overall, but also gave you the ability to drill down, so you could actually see which who's performing better than others. I mean, our approach was that we, as I said, we needed to get a mandate. So we had that mandate from the executive. We had the kind of the direction about what we needed to do. We knew the KPI that we were going to use to actually measure the efficiency of the process, which is first time match rate. And then we looked at how we were actually then going to report that KPI. So I've got the mandate, we knew what the KPI was, then to actually produce a dashboard. So we're able to do it on a weekly basis to actually show where the first time match rate was, and actually provide the detail across the business. So individuals can actually see for different parts of the business what their first time match rate was, and then use that as the means of actually showing how we're actually progressing as we go through the whole challenge. So we provided that and we developed that. And then in terms of the team, our approach was not necessarily going straight to let's have a look at a system, let's have a look at automation. The team were extremely knowledgeable about the process and about the system, so why not use the kind of knowledge that they've got to then start to really do some deep dives and to really look at the whole process, which is what we did. So we did the deep dives into the individual parts of the process, which I'll come on to understand exactly what was happening. And obviously once you've done that, as you go through, you might end up with a whole bunch of improvements and issues, which is what we did. So that needed to be put together somehow in a coherent plan so we could actually monitor and track the progress. So we used agile and put them into sprints. So we rather than going with a big bang approach of having all the improvements saved up to the end, we actually looked at the improvements, we chunked them up and we put them into sprints or waves so we could actually have resources allocated, make the improvements, and then see the impact that they have on the first time match rate, and then move on to the next wave and the next wave. So that's how our approach kind of differed to what you might assume a way of doing it. So the deep dives were kind of the real critical parts of this. So you needed to actually stop and use the people, use the teams, use their knowledge to really stop and think about the process and what were they currently doing, and was it the right thing to do, and was it something that they'd always done, or was it something that actually they could look at and go, is there a better way of doing it? And that's how we then started to look at the master data issues, to look at then the supplier issues that kind of flowed on from those process issues and the data that the suppliers were actually giving us. As I said, we put all these into buckets and waves so we could actually chunk it up. And then we actually had a weekly cadence of updates. So we kept kind of the initiative and the momentum going throughout the whole piece of work that we were engaged with. And it meant having a lot of collaboration across not just within the team and the departments within P2P, but also with procurement and with the business. So we could actually get their input and understanding of what we were trying to do, but also understand the issues that they had. So the deep dives and this kind of peeling off the onion layers, where we began to realize that once you actually looked at one particular issue and maybe had a solution to that, it then kind of brought to light another issue that you weren't expecting, and so on. And we ended up having all these layers that you had to unpeel. So if I give you an example with the POs, for example, you might, if you have a system where you're generating POs and you have a master data system that has email addresses in it and you're getting invoices that have PO numbers on there, you would assume that it's all working. But when we looked at it, you began to realize that actually some of the email addresses were not quite accurate and up to date, or you had a centralized PO box where they went to within a supplier if it was a large supplier. And in some cases, some of the email addresses were actually internal email addresses where the PO went back to the requisitioner to then forward on to the supplier. So when we started to really dig into just that one area around the PO and it's being sent to the supplier, you started to realize that actually there was a number of issues that we needed to fix in order to get to the point where when we had POs, the supplier was actually getting it. So they stood a really good chance of then actually quoting that PO on the invoice, which then started to obviously give us a bit of help around first time matching. So POs, there's a lot of other issues, but I won't go into all of those issues. Just wanted to quickly give you a flavor of kind of the approach and the principles around doing those deep dives and digging into it and expecting not to solve it first time, but actually having layers and layers you need to get to. On the invoicing, we still have paper invoices. We have paper invoices that were being sent to our office, and obviously under COVID, a lot of the offices were manned, so we had invoices that were actually being sent to an office, which were being collected, but not on the same regular basis as if they were actually going to an emailer box, where you could then pick them up and process them. And we had emails with invoices that were actually being sent to the business. So despite the fact that we had a central box to send invoices to so that we can then scan them, they were still sometimes going to different parts of the business. So there was a delay in actually getting those. So we weren't aware sometimes that actually the invoice had already been received by us, but it was in another part of the business. So there was work that was needed to be done to work with the business to get them to understand that actually the invoices needed to come directly to us in order for us to scan them, in order to match, in order to then pay, so that we didn't actually have a delay in actually paying our suppliers at a time when it was quite critical in terms of COVID and the need to actually maintain businesses and cash flow. So on the invoices, we had those type of issues. And then obviously the last one around the goods receipting is always kind of a big problem for most of us, just around getting that final piece and getting people to actually receipt on time, which again didn't always happen, and they didn't understand the impact that actually delaying receipting actually caused in terms of matching. If it wasn't done on time, then it meant that we actually had to do some manual matching rather than them being matched first time. And also on the GRNing, we actually had issues which some of you may have, just around some of the dates and some of the date ranges. If you have goods and services that are provided over a period of time and the invoice is dated over a period, and you're then receipting using what you think is the right way, so 01 for January period, sometimes that caused issues around the format of that receipting, which we then looked at and then produced basically a translation table which took all these different ways in which you could actually present dates in whatever format to then translate them into a single standard format, which we could then use and then match against in terms of the PO and the invoice. So all of those kind of issues, of which there are a lot more, just in terms of peeling off those onion layers to actually get down to the root causes and then to fix them one by one, put them into the plan, and then start to work through, implement the change to either the process or the behaviours, to then see the impact that that has via the dashboard that we had in place. And that's kind of how we went through it. Surprisingly, there was a number of what I would call unintended or unexpected consequences from the piece that we did. So I've got them listed down. I won't go through them all, but give you time to read some of those. But it was quite pleasing that actually, once we'd actually gone through and done this piece of work, which actually is still that we're still progressing, the team are still working through, but all these kind of unexpected consequences where we had suppliers that were now kind of bought into our approach, and we had a much stronger relationship with our suppliers in terms of their billing systems back to us, so we could then actually use the invoices that they were sending us in the right way, and then do that also matching, first time matching, in order to then free up some time within the team to actually do more value added activities rather than matching invoices. We also were able to work a lot closer with procurement just in terms of the vendors that they were onboarding, and also we became aware of if they were actually negotiated contract rebates for paying on time, we were then able to then understand what they had actually promised and what was in the contract, so we could then start to work on that particular vendor to see whether we could actually make all the improvements and target individual vendors to then improve our chances of actually getting the rebates on the contracts. And then the other big thing around the team were amazing. I'm really ever so proud of the team. Without the team, this wouldn't have happened. It is all down to the people rather than a system or automation. It's the team and their knowledge and how they put their arms around what we were trying to do to improve the process, and actually the whole kind of concept of continuous improvement. All of that was kind of all consumed within the team. So we had a lot, as it says, we had a lot of passion and determination within the team to actually make these changes and to move the first time match rate. We had a lot of honest conversations about what was working, what wasn't working, and as I said, the people is the key thing for me. I said it's an amazing piece of work that the team has done, and as a result of that, from where we got to, we had quite a lot of recognition from the various bodies within the industry. So we had some awards from the APA and the PPN, Midland Shared Service Forum, and as you can see on the screen, where we were at the very beginning to where we ended up as at the end of January. And if there's anyone on the call at the moment who's kind of can then give Dan and myself just a view as to where it is now, that would be great. But actually, that in itself is a huge change from where we were to where we got to, just by doing that hard kind of deep dives into the process without actually having to spend any kind of money around capital investment on either a system or automation. So this was all done within the team, and that's why it is it's a different approach to what some people may take, and I would highly recommend looking at and spending the time with the team and using the knowledge, and take some of the steps in the approach that I've gone through to actually pick out those improvements and to structure them and then do them in individual chunks to actually move the process on. And you do end up with improvement, and you end up with a team that actually understands the process a lot more, but also everybody else that actually you've worked with within the business now has a much better view of procure to pay and what the processes are and what we actually need to do to achieve paying people on time. So that's my story. That's the approach that we took. So if I hand back to Dan, I know from our point of view, if there are any questions that have come through, then we'd be more than happy to go through and answer some of those.
Great, thank you, Tim. I mean, just consider that is a 3x performance improvement. And if you consider that idea about technology and digitalization amplify efficiencies and they amplify inefficiencies, as a start point, I think is amazing. I think what you've done and the team's done is a great result. And imagine what you do after you digitize further as well. So that's great. So what do we learn? I'm just conscious, do ask your questions. I know we've got another 2 or 3 minutes to go. Put any more questions you have. We've got a bunch coming through. Put questions in the interface. Even if we don't answer them live, you'll get a response. So that's it. If you've got a question or just a view that you want Tim's view back on, just share that now. Couple of concluding points. We talk a lot about process-driven change and technology-driven change, and often we get confused, and sometimes our stakeholders get confused about the difference between the two things. And so a process, what is it? What is a process? Is it just the steps that SAP takes you through? What is it? And I think it's really important to get some generic understanding about it's much bigger than that. It's much bigger than just a system. It's how people use the information and the transactions and the habits and behaviors that support it. And there's a great little definition there, and I'd encourage you to consider that. And I think the other thing that Tim's and the team did well is one of the biggest challenges we see is people go down these avenues to drive change, but they're not clear what good looks like, which sounds so obvious, but actually it's complicated. Because if you think about procure to pay or source to pay or any other end-to-end process, those two lighthouses are examples of the pillars, the towers of the organization, if you like. So the tower of procurement, their view of what good looks like will be different to what the tower of finance and AP looks like, and that's okay. But it's our job to try and harmonize a common view. It's not about replacing one view with the other, it's harmonizing it to get a common view of what good looks like. And believe me, that's the hardest question in the book. So spend some time on that. And on the simplification piece that Tim's been talking about is, there's a lot of design thinking that goes into the key essence of elimination, simplification. Elimination is the best form of automation. Absolutely. And it's worth thinking about that. How can you eliminate unnecessary non-value added steps? Absolutely critical. And if you look at this kind of maturity model and optimizing a business process, what Tim and his team did were very much focusing on the first 3 steps: understand, analyze, adjust. And they got a 3x performance improvement by doing that. And then you apply your digitization and you're measuring an iterative refinement, and then you're on a great run. The challenge is quite often people apply the digitization first and you end up amplifying the inefficiency, as we've discussed already. But as Tim made the point, there are no quick fixes or easy hacks. I love this quote because it's really important just to remind everybody it's hard to make substantial change is hard work. But it doesn't matter whether you apply a big piece of technology or apply your intellects, it's still going to be hard work. So get the return you can. So that's what we've talked through. we've got some questions to quickly answer for you. Just before I get to those, we're talking about this whole global process discussion. Just going to give you a little preview here. If you're interested in this, let us know. On the 19th of May, we're running a very kind of related session around the whole issue of global process ownership. And those of, many of you are going to be all over that. You might want to be part of that. There's two very experienced speakers sharing their stories there. So, questions. Let's have a look at the questions. I'm just going to just be 2 or 3 minutes here. So, Tim, I think a question here. As you went through your process, which of the key assets or focus points, purchase order, invoice, goods receipt, had the biggest impact on the resulting improvement in first-time match rate? So when you did all that work, which of those 3 assets had the biggest impact?
I think the one that had the biggest, or slightly more, I would say, is the whole piece around goods receipting. Just in terms of the immediate impact it had to actually look at the way in which people were actually receipting, to use a kind of basic translation table to then have a standard way of receipting, which is what we tried to get to. Now you could, we tried different ways of actually doing some training, doing some education, doing tips of the week, all sorts of kind of comms to the business around receipting, and it wasn't quite always kind of landing because maybe people didn't have the deep understanding of the impact of not having a standard was. So in the end, we looked at a different way of doing it and actually said, well, actually, let's try and work on the principle that they don't have to worry how they're receipting. We'll just take whatever way in which they're receipting and we'll convert it into a standard which we could then use. So the GRNing, that receipting piece was definitely out of the 3, it kind of gave you the biggest bang once actually we had done the change and put it in.
That's a really
actually, sorry, Dan.
That's a really interesting point because it is consistent with a lot of the other feedback we get in that goods receipt, people spend a lot of time worrying about the PO and the invoice, but goods receipting they all have a massively influenced by human behavior, but goods receipting is probably the biggest influence of human behavior, hence why it's the biggest impact getting it right. So thanks for that. I'm just conscious of time. I'm going to ask you one more question from the audience here, and then we'll let people get away, but we will do the rest by email. You kind of touched on this, but how did your relationship with procurement develop during the process? And I think the question is very much about the relationship with procurement rather than the activities.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, actually. And it's a very interesting question because something we found throughout the process that actually our relationship with procurement really developed. We needed to actually have procurement on board and understanding what we were trying to do. And actually right from the very beginning, we had our procurement director engaged in terms of the challenge that we had and how we were going to approach it. And we actually had his kind of buy-in and feedback on a regular basis throughout the process. But then when you started to get down to discussions with individual suppliers and onboarding and payment terms and presenting, through their billing systems, the invoices, it also then spread out to the category managers. So you end up with those category managers then understanding a lot more about the P2P end-to-end process and what's involved. So, absolutely, it's a very good point. I mean, we did actually develop that relationship as part of this, and at the end of it, we had a much stronger relationship. And on both sides, we understood a lot more about procurement, and procurement understood a lot more about us.
That's great. So there's a great advertisement for better collaboration. So thanks, Tim. I'm conscious of time. It's 40 minutes, a little bit longer than we said. I'd like to thank you, Tim, and also all your team who are not necessarily all on this call, but I think you should be very proud of what you've achieved, and particularly going to first principles and achieving such big impact and then setting it up for the next stage. Excellent.
Exactly, and I would just kind of just echo what you said, just in terms of where the commitment and the kind of the ownership that we have from the team and where we got to. I said it's one of the proudest things that I've done to kind of be involved with the process and to have the team do what they do.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us. I hope you found it useful. If you've got any questions, if the interface is, well, hopefully just ask them now and we'll do them by email. Thank you very much for your time. And if you've got any questions, just come back to us by email if you don't have time to do it through the interface. Thanks very much. Have a great rest of your day, rest of your evening, rest of your morning, depending where you are. Thanks a lot. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye. Bye, everyone.